Hi, guys, it's Mrs. Terpstra. Today, we're going to talk about slavery, which isn't always a fun topic to talk about, but it's important that we learn from our mistakes in history. So let's get rolling. I'm going to give you kind of the shortened version here. So, first of all, our term is mercantilism. That is the main economic theory of the 1600s. So, when I say economy, what do I mean by that? It means like the value of our money and our wealth in our country. And in the 1600s, it was basically determined by two things: gold and silver. The more gold and silver you had, the more powerful you were. And that's why our explorers that we just talked about, like Cortez and Pizarro, they stole all the gold from the Aztecs and the Incas because that made their country more powerful when they brought it back. Now, today, is that what makes a country powerful? Not so much, right? We've talked about some of those things. Maybe it's population, number of soldiers, weaponry, good leaders, government, resources, right? And we used to back our money with gold. We did. So for every so many of these that we printed, oops, upside down, we would put a gold bar in the reserve. And that would make it have value. Because when you think about it, what is this made of? It's paper, right? So weird. So we would put gold in the reserve. We don't do that anymore. We use what's called the fiat system. Now, if you can, I would recommend that you go to this YouTube video. It's like a 5-minute video and watch it because it'll explain these things. For now, I'm just going to define these for you and help you a little bit. And then if you can do that, you can do that. And pause this at any time, by the way, if I'm going too fast. So fiat money means that money is not backed by an outside resource. Money not backed by an outside resource. So again, our money used to be backed with gold. It's not anymore. We use kind of a formula that includes inflation rates, employment rates, the value of other money around the world, like the yen, for example, all kinds of stuff. Okay. The Fed is a group of 12 regional banks around the United States, and they're the ones that make these decisions about our money. The Fed is not linked to any government branch. So 12 regional banks that make decisions, they are not related to our three branches of government, which is probably a smart idea. So they're not influenced by all the politics. Okay. Our third word is inflation. So what does inflation mean? It means that the value of our dollar goes down. It's not worth near as much. Okay. What is a deflation then, or depression? It means that we have value in our dollar. In fact, the value goes up, but there's just not enough to go around. That's a depression. Okay. So let's use an example. You probably heard of the Great Depression in the United States. Worst time in history. We just didn't have enough money to go around. Our banks went broke. Our stock market crashed. We didn't have jobs. We didn't have food, right? Things were really bad. So that would be a depression. Well, Germany actually had a depression as well, about 10, 15 years before us. And their way of fixing the depression was to just print a bunch of money. The problem is they didn't back their money with anything of value. So that threw them into what? If you said inflation, you are correct. Yes, they went into inflation. So it got so bad, like you would have to take like $1 million for a loaf of bread, a wheelbarrow full of money for a cup of coffee. In fact, they started actually burning their money in Germany instead of firewood because it was worth less than the firewood. So let's go back to the Great Depression in America then. How did we get out of the Great Depression? Well, two things happened. First of all, our president went in the hole as far as the government, and we created jobs right here in South Dakota. Like we hired people to build highways, not Highway 90, but like the highway that goes by Huset's. That was a part of that program. We hired people to build public buildings like libraries, city halls, things like that. We also hired people to make state parks like the state parks we have here in South Dakota. So those were a way for us to provide jobs for people. And then what big event happened in the 1940s that helped us get out of the Great Depression? If you said World War II, you are correct. Yes, war can be very good for an economy, especially if you win. right? Because it means all of you guys, you were fighting in World War II. So that means you had a roof over your head, well, sort of. You had food, you had a paycheck, right? It meant that all those girls, you guys were working in a factory. You were making tanks and you were making planes, which meant you had income for your family too. If you lost the war, might not turn out so great, but that did pull us out of the Depression. Our last question: what is considered the safe balance for our economy? Just a little bit of inflation because we want to keep growing. And that's why that bottle of pop that you just purchased is $2.35 instead of a buck like it was a few years ago. That's inflation. Okay, moving on. Our next term is a balance of trade. When we traded in the 1600s, we were all about making money. We wanted a positive balance, making money. So, for example, I might go to that tribe in Africa and I would say, I'll pay you these metal pots and pans for all that gold over there. We were making a positive balance, weren't we? Now, think about it from their perspective, though. When you've made all of your pots and pans out of animal bone or wood, pretty impressive to see things made in a factory. On the other hand, why do we value gold or diamonds so much? I mean, Africans couldn't understand, what is it? Oh, I can't get this to go here. Why is it that my diamond is worth so much to you? It's a rock, but we see it as jewelry and a marriage. Think about perspective a little bit. Okay, colonies were really important. We were taking colonies all over the world, especially England, for two reasons. Number one, it was a source of new raw materials, things that we couldn't get in our own country. So let's use an example you can relate to. Let's talk about Hawaii, because we basically made Hawaii join us as a country. What are some products that they have that we don't? If you said pineapple and sugar cane, you are right. Things we didn't have a lot of in the United States. Now, sometimes those colonies can get things from us that they don't normally have. So, what do we have right here in South Dakota that Hawaii does not? If you said cows, you're right. And if you said corn, you are absolutely right. There's not a lot of corn fields and open range in an island, Hawaii, right? That's why if you go and eat at like a McDonald's in Hawaii, those hamburgers are so expensive because they have to ship in all that meat typically. Number two, colonies were very important because it was a place for us to sell our finished goods. Finished means things you make in a factory, like those pots and pans we talked about. Or imagine being a tribe in Africa and you've been wearing animal skins, and then you see something like this. Pretty impressive, right? Now, we aren't in our Asian unit yet, but I do want to mention this because we're training with Asia at this time in history too. What are some things we got from Asia that we didn't have in our country? Spices, yep, and silk. You prom girls, you want those for your prom dresses, right? Did you know that silk is made from the spit of this worm? Kind of gross when you think about it, isn't it? We're going to skip this slide for time's sake. So the demand for slaves increased because of two events. Number one, the discovery of the Americas. Remember, our explorers are going all over the world, right? And they're finding not only North America, but Central and South America. And second, the discovery of sugarcane. When we think of a product in slavery, what do we think of? We think of cotton in the South, right? But actually, there were more slaves on sugarcane plantations and in the mines than there were in cotton. So that really made a demand for slaves. A lot of them were located in Brazil and the Caribbean. Like you see, this map down here shows the sugarcane plantations in Brazil. So Central America, they came to us in North America and said, we need laborers, we need slave labor to work these sugarcane plantations. So what did they do? They sent Indians first. But of course, eventually we started running out of them, didn't we? And so then we started looking across the pond to Africa, and African slaves, unfortunately, were the answer. We're going to actually move on to the next slide because it says the same thing and it has a diagram. So it'll be easier for you to understand. So we use the triangular trade for slavery, and you're going to need to label these on your test. So there were already slave traders in Europe. So why reinvent the wheel in America? We used what was already there. So we paid those slave traders things they couldn't get in their country, like sugar, tobacco, and cotton. Sugar, tobacco, and cotton. And then our slaves traders, they went down and got the slaves. Now, here's what they did. Remember that not all tribes got along with each other. They went to war against each other. So they would go to this tribe over here and pay them to track down the other slaves in Africa. And they would pay them textiles, which is cloth that you make in a factory. Rum, of course. Why is all the rum gone? If you like Pirates of the Caribbean. And any manufactured goods at a factory, like pots and pans, things like that. The third trek, of course, is bringing the slaves to the Americas. All right, this is a map showing slavery for 200 years, from 1650 to 1860 approximately. And I want to just point out a couple of things to you for your test. First of all, notice they went along the coast as they went to go across the ocean. Makes sense. That way they can get supplies and they can cross on the shortest route. Most of the slaves were taken in this slave coast right here in this area, in those 4 countries. Now take a look at your boxes. See these boxes? Which country had the most slaves? And you're going to want to write this down. Number 1 is Brazil with 5 million slaves. Good. And what kind of products did they use those slaves for? Take a look at your key over here. If you said coffee and mining, you're correct. So this was 5 million. Which country is number 2? Number 2 would be, the West Indies with 4.5 million. And what products did they use the slaves for? Sugarcane and mining. Yep. Now let's go right to number 3 is a tie between 2 countries. What do you see? Number 3 is a tie between Peru with 0.5 million and the United States, America with 0.5 million. So let's just go to the United States here. What products did we use slaves for? There are 4 of them. Cotton, tobacco, rice, and sugarcane. Good, very good. Oh, my point of that, if I can go back, was just that, we had a lot of slaves in the United States, but we had 0.5 million compared to Brazil that had 5 million. Really puts it in perspective, doesn't it? All right, our treatment of slaves was horrendous on the boats. The Middle Passage is the journey of our slaves from Africa to the Americas. Slave ship captains expected to lose 25% of their product on that journey by suffocation, disease, things like that, because they were packed in so tight. So their answer sounds crazy, but their answer was to pack in more people so that they could make up for the 25% that they lost. Now, I know I said the word product, and let me explain that. They saw those people as a product. The prime age for a slave, the most valuable, were people about your age right here in this classroom, because you were young, you're strong, you're energetic, and to be honest, girls, you're old enough to have babies, which means as a slave owner, you could have free slaves without paying for them. So a young man your age would be worth about $1,000 today. And a girl your age would be worth about $500 today. So they sure didn't want to lose that money as you think of it as a product. So we'll talk a little bit about that Middle Passage in just a moment. We also had death rates on the plantations. Sometimes slaves would run away. And one of the most common reasons was to find their families because they were divided from their wives or their children. I don't blame them. I would do the same thing. Um, so sometimes they would punish them without killing them first, like they might take an axe and cut off their toes so that they couldn't run, but they could still work. But if you were a problem, they would kill you. And there was no law that protected those slaves because they weren't considered a citizen of the United States, which is really sad. So we lost a lot of people on the slave plantations too. All right, the next thing we're going to do in class is we're going to show you a clip from the movie Amistad. If you're not there today, I'll just talk about it a little bit. But I would really recommend this is an interesting movie to watch for extra credit. Um, so, some of the things that you would see in this clip are that they were packed in very tight. In fact, let's take a look at this next slide. This next slide is a diagram of a slave ship. Here they separated men and women. They chained them to the floor. They used shelves, kind of like in the Holocaust. In fact, if you'll see here, it says they had a height of 2 feet 7 inches. Think about being chained to a wood shelf like that for 5 months. And they didn't give you bathroom breaks. So imagine you are lying in urine and feces and blood and vomit. It's not a wonder they died of disease. And you can imagine being packed in this tight, how they could suffocate as they had a storm and the bodies would shift. They used children in smaller areas because they were smaller and they could pack them in tighter. Some of the things you might see on the movie clip on the upper deck, they did rape the women. Yes, they did. That's something they didn't talk about, but they did. They dumped the bodies overboard. There was no funeral like we would do today. They whipped the men, and it wasn't that that person had done something wrong, it was a power thing. So they would take the strongest men and they would whip one of them one day in front of the rest to show them as an example. And then the next day they would take the other. Now, at the end of the scene, a mother and her baby, she chooses to go overboard. And I want us to think about that from their perspective. Think about what they must have been imagining. Remember that all these people from Africa are not from the same tribe. So they don't speak all the same language. They don't know each other. And they sure don't know Portuguese, which is probably what this captain and this crew are. So they have no idea who these people are and where they're going. But it's as close to HELL as possible, isn't it, on Earth? And I can't imagine what this mother must have been thinking. But I guess she took her death in her own terms. Horrible things. Now, something else that they did later, England and France outlawed slavery before we did in the United States, and they would send out police ships to catch these slave ship captains. But you didn't want to get caught because number one, they would free your slaves. Number two, they would fine you a bunch of money. So they would take a ball and chain like this and put it on one of your slaves, and then chain each slave to each other until you're all connected. And then they would push the first one over the side of the ship. And the next one would go screaming and scratching, and the next one until the whole row were on the bottom of the ocean. They would actually dump the evidence, and then they would go right back and get another shipload of slaves. That's how little they thought of these poor people. Horrible, isn't it? All right, how many of you have heard of the song Amazing Grace? Old church song, maybe? Well, what you might not know is the guy that wrote that song is a guy named John Newton. He was a slave ship captain. He saw and did all those horrible things that we just talked about. And he got caught on one of his trips in a storm. And he went down on his knees and he said, God, if you forgive me, I will change my life for you. And he did. And he became a servant or a cleaner, you might say, for a bunch of monks. And he heard about this Martin Luther guy that said you could be forgiven, you know? And so that's really what this song is about. So I'd really like you to maybe look at that, listen to the song, because I think it might make a difference as to how you interpret the song, knowing his background. He eventually does make a difference. He testifies in England in court, and he talks about all those things that happened on the ship that nobody talked about, and he ends up helping get slavery outlawed in England. And that's what this movie is about, if you're interested for extra credit. What is the point of this graph? Really simple. Slavery increased in what era? 1700s. That's where it made its peak. We got to about 6 million in the 1700s. Very good. As you can imagine, African rulers opposed slavery, but nobody listened. Nobody listened. And some of the tribes were actually for it because if I'm trading with you, I'm making money on this, aren't I? So if you look at the population of Africa, it just plummets at this time, not only because of slavery, but because these tribes are killing each other. They're going to war against each other over the issue of slavery. So, how does it all end? Well, the first group to say slavery was wrong in the United States were the Quakers. Remember them from like colony times? They said it was wrong, but nobody listened. The first country to outlaw slavery were the French in the French Revolution. They said that all men shall be created equal. However, what's missing in that statement? Yes, they forgot about women. So, women, it's going to take a little bit longer. But they were the first to give equality to all men. Then in 1807, England abolishes slavery. And then finally, in the 1860s, the United States abolishes slavery after what big event? You should know this. If you said the Civil War, you are correct. You're going to notice a pattern in world history class, especially at the beginning. We are always about 50 years behind England in a lot of different things because we're still a new country. It isn't until about World War II that we start doing things first. You'll see there's kind of a pattern there. All right. And we're not going to use the last slide just because of time's sake. If you want to use it, you're more than welcome to. Remember that you can always pause this at any time and go back and get anything that you missed. Thanks for listening.